All right. So, howdy to all of you out there in internet land. There it is. Hope I didn't miss the first impression. My name is Mark Whalerider and Fogadalma. And so this is a continuation of my piece called Digging Up God for a Sacred Campfire with Darwin, Einstein, Gandhi, Harriet Tubman, and the gang. So Black Elk, Harriet Tubman, Ashanti Harriet Tubman, Jose B.A.E. Silva, and Lao Tzu's Kung Fu Yoga Baseball, A Vision Quest and Spiritual Odyssey from Harvard, New York, and Kenya to the UN city streets, Brussels, and Brazil. So that pretty much is the working title. So now, continuing on, right? This is part two. So I'd already gotten to, Darwin and his basic trip of evolution, in which he developed got his material as a naturalist. His specimens, he was able to collect his specimens as a naturalist, sailing on the Darwin on the Beagles, HMS Beagles survey trip that was supposed to last 2 years but lasted 5 years. And in particular, the specimens that he's most famous for, the Darwin's finches, the ones that were all finch species, but had diversified in the ecological niches on the Galapagos Islands there. And the little irony, in fact, that Darwin himself hadn't identified by name most of the finches that he collected, although he had identified more of the mockingbirds. But I guess there's an interesting filtering process that went on, so that we don't talk about Darwin's mockingbirds. But their diversification in terms of their beaks, particularly, but then the body size and various related parts of the elements of the creature, and then also the giant sloth tooth that he had collected in Argentina, I think it is, which he had known as a result of earlier work by Manuel Torres and a connection. The connections between Torres and an illustrator in Madrid, Spain, and then Georges Cuvier in Paris, who had identified, doing his comparative anatomy, had identified the fact that the giant fossil skeleton found by Torres in Argentina around 1800 was, in fact, similar to a sloth. So, fascinating stuff there that was then available for Darwin to read about as he made his way in his own life's adventure from being a doctor in his father's footsteps to becoming then possibly, I guess the idea was he was getting a divinity education that allowed him to ride the country parson and parson naturalist wave that was going on. John Henslow Smith, in particular, was one major connection that he had at Cambridge University, where he'd come from Edinburgh Medical School. So that then is the naturalist education that Darwin had, and was the context then when he was sitting down and began questioning. That was part of his then the situation in which he was comfortable and seeing the necessity in the legacy of his own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, another physician who had been philosophizing about the transmutation of species. And so the transformational processes that might be really going on of species, instead of the religious idea, which was then also a hypothesis in natural philosophy, science, biological science, as it was called at the time, of the sites of creation points, multiple creation points. So then it was during that that Darwin made the crossover in his questions, in his own religious thinking, thinking about religious issues, thinking about metaphysics and the related issues. He asked questions about the wasp, the parasitic wasp, that in the one example that he gives is the one that stings a caterpillar and lays an egg in the caterpillar that then hatches in the paralyzed living caterpillar, and with the larva, the wasp larva, eating the caterpillar alive, the butterfly larva, right? Caterpillars are a butterfly larva, and eating that caterpillar alive for its own growth as a wasp larva. So then Darwin then observed this and then posed the question, how could a good God permit such cruelty in nature? And then he also asked, along with other questions, Darwin also asked another nice, clear one, what is the relevance of Christ for science? And so I'd like to start looking at these other characters in our team to understand exactly what we're talking about, how we can talk about this in a little bit more scholarly fashion to seek the truth, and in its diversity and in its and accuracy, really, with the interplay between complexity and simplicity. So if we go to Einstein, for example, Einstein is his own story, of course, a major genius story and amazing celebrity story. So Einstein then had his own little life adventure and journey, which we might, look at in terms of, how he was born in Germany, in Prussia, in Württemberg, influenced by Prussia after the unification of Germany, and made his way then to Switzerland for college, where he studied in a physics program, and then found work in a patent office, famously. And so he worked on his PhD, and he had his miracle year by a certain point. That was 1905. His Annum Mirabilis, where he had 4 papers published that were major advances, just based on his thinking through a number of things and working out a number of things in physics. And so there were delays, right? It took 3 years before he was granted a lecturing position in 1908 in a Bern University in Switzerland. And then it took another 5 years until 1913, when Einstein was offered a position in Berlin at the Prussian Academy of Sciences and the University of Berlin. And that involves a number of events, including Einstein's refusal to so that gets into his human side. So the World War I was about to begin, and that became a crucial context with interesting events going on. Scientifically, then, we get into the mix and we actually see all kinds of things going on. um, as a subject that was made a famous movie. Arthur Eddington, the British Quaker physicist, then became a crucial linchpin for recognizing Einstein's work then on general relativity, that fueled then an experiment that Einstein failed to complete because of the war, one kind in his own version, and then Eddington proposed another version and was able to get support and prepare for it for after the war, after World War I, by 1919. And it was that accomplishment with its own psychological, social, and then in particular impact and consequences for secular consequences. And that made Einstein then a celebrity, and then led to his own world tour through the popularity and the reach of the English language culture. So, and that leads on, of course, to further events. And so it's ultimately by 1940 that we get to the specific issue that I wanted to mention up front about Einstein, in that by 1940, of course, World War II was underway. Einstein had already refused to have been engaged in American educational activity. And then upon trying to return in 1933, I think, after Hitler's election, Einstein then was protected and saved from any direct confrontation with the Nazis because he was informed in Belgium, no less, of how the Nazis had invaded his apartment, his and his wife's Elsa's apartment, and were being aggressive. So then Einstein was able to avoid any further problems in Nazi Germany and find refuge then and safe haven in another place that turned out to be Princeton University in the United States. So let me take off my hat here. So that was 1933, and until he arrived safely in Princeton, and was able to settle. But then by 1936, the tragedy as Elsa was ill and passed away. And so by 1940, then we get to Einstein being involved with some Jewish religious conferences or religious conferences of one kind or another. And Einstein then made his famous comment about science and religion, that one is lame without the other and one is blind without the other. I'm not even going to, I'm more interested in leaving that a little bit ambiguous. But then in 1941, I believe it's a separate occasion, Einstein made another comment as well, just to put it up front, about epistemology and science. So, first of all, we have this science and religion. Science and religion, one is lame without the other, one is blind without the other. So, is that a profound truthful statement by Einstein? Well, it's more of an observation by Einstein and a proposal that requires reflection. But he's suggesting the interrelatedness of science and religion, which is quite it's quite an enlightened statement considering the kind of polarization that have been going on. There are a number of issues going, like Auguste Comte. Logical positivism, for example, basically attributed to Auguste Comte around the time of Darwin, no less, around 1840 or so, beginning at that time. Auguste Comte, I've learned about him as a sociologist, but he was also a philosopher of science who was speculating about the relationship between the harder sciences and the new developing sciences of psychology and sociology, for example. And so logical positivism is attributed to him, but it was this larger movement then of people treating the subjects of psychology and sociology and human beings with the same mentality of studying physical processes in the physical and life sciences, the conventional ones, the original ones of physics, chemistry, and even biology, which already starts to cross a few lines and have its own issues since it deals with life, living creatures of various kinds. So now, how can we evaluate this kind of proposal by Einstein that science and religion are related? Well, I've got lots of ideas myself, right? I think I've already mentioned to you that my background in biological anthropology already entered into. I studied the evolution of speech and symbol use, and then religious ritual and microsociology. So I was already getting a good background and foundation in my college studies. And that has, and I've recently really straightened a lot of that material out and looked at it closely. So what might I suggest? Well, Gregor Mendel in the time of Darwin, besides the fact that Darwin was one of these country parsons and parson naturalists that was very popular in England at that time, already provides a kind of suggestion about that close contact, that close connection. Gregor Mendel in Austria, as even a Catholic monk, and his work on peas and discovering and developing a work that led to a very clear empirical kind of conclusion of suggesting what we now know as genetic traits, is another good example of this interrelationship that a religious person could be very interested in studying the natural world and physical issues. Now, then Einstein's second comment then about science and epistemology raises the question, well, what the heck is epistemology anyway? So the rise of the social sciences like psychology and sociology, and then anthropology also, which then fit into an area, became the social sciences, what some call the social sciences, or what are widely called the social sciences, along with maybe what are called the humanities, like history and philosophy, then is already basically very much at showing what epistemology is. Epistemology is usually talked about in its very philosophical sense, that so what is the question of knowledge? That epistemology is the study of knowledge. And so that a philosophical formulation of it is, well, is it just a belief? Is knowledge just a belief? No, it's a justified, true belief. I think now there's even they've added on warrant, where there's warrant for a justified truth and true belief. Along with the issues of philosophical truth, which is logical coherence, and correspondence with reality for two major parts of that, which is basically empiricism. So epistemology. And so, in looking at this, I haven't found anybody going into the nature of what is an academic discipline, but we have the basic distinction, the difference between the physical and life sciences on the one hand, and the human, social sciences, and humanities on the other hand. That became the difference between logical positivism and something that came up that was called anti-positivism. That is called anti-positivism, but that also is called interpretivism and I think it's also called perspectivism. So Max Weber is a pretty well-known sociologist historically who was one of the major contributors to that idea. Georg Simmel was there, along with some other people developing important angles on that. Interpretivism, the need to understand symbols, symbol use, symbol norms, symbol values, symbolic values, and to have understanding based on that of when dealing with human studies, that I like to call the psychosocial studies. And so, you see these kind of issues coming up with like behaviorism and psychology. When we're talking about, Pavlov's dogs being a famous example of conditioned reflex, where dogs could be conditioned to salivate when presented with a piece of meat and a bell being rung, right? So then, with the proper conditioning, you can create a situation in which you ring the bell without presenting the meat, and the dog starts to salivate. So the dog shows a conditioned reflex. And so that then led to behavioral psychology, with examples like little Albert, who was a boy, very young boy, who had no fear of a rabbit. But then J.B. Watson, a Harvard psychologist, and his crew rang a gong that scared the boy when they presented the rabbit, and they were able to create a conditioned reflex in which the boy became scared when he saw the rabbit, simply when he saw the rabbit, without them ringing a gong. And then fortunately, there's a good follow-up to that, in that Mary Cover Jones was a woman academic, just to make that point, who observed that particular kind of conditioning and then went so far as to decondition. She was the one to actually do the deconditioning and restore the natural lack of fear in situations like that. There's a nice case for that, as I recall. So, epistemology, right? So there's a difference between the sciences and the social sciences and humanities as two general areas. And then I began looking at this, and I began realizing, well, in every discipline there are these issues of, does someone know the issues that are involved? Some basic level at least, to have some basic familiarity at least with the basic understanding from psychology, from sociology, from anthropology, history and philosophy. Do they have it or not? And how are they conducting all their thinking about that? So I realized that the term epistemology needs to be applied at really that level, but I didn't really see that happening. So that's one of the innovations that I've had to make in using that term epistemology. But there it is. Einstein already used it in terms of science, but now in terms of science and religion, then we see that same thing. And Stephen Jay Gould made an important statement about non-overlapping magisteria that is very relevant to that. As have others, as you get into the issues, and we get into the issues in more detail. In terms of looking at Darwin, then, a good example of that kind of situation is when we see, for instance, Max Muller. Max Muller was a German guy who had gone to study in France and then went to England and became a professor of Indo-European languages. And in the process, in his study of Indian culture with the language, he also became quite a specialist in comparative religious studies. And he became one of the first lecturers in the Gifford lecture series, which is well known in natural theology, the modernizing of thinking around religious issues in natural theology. So Max Muller also had contact with Darwin, and one of the issues is that Darwin was very linked to thinking about the basic grunts and how that might have become language. And also thinking a lot about sexual selection and staying very tied to the biological processes very tightly. Whereas Max Muller was already quite understanding about the range of what are really cognitive processes, how language really developed in very many showing cognitive ways in the more complex contexts of human culture and psychosocial activity that is really necessary, you have to understand in order to understand the complexity of how human language has developed. So that's Max Muller as an example. And so that is an example of literacy and this difference of epistemology, that Darwin was really focusing on the biology, and his thinking about religion never really got very far. He never really took someone like Max Muller seriously, for example. He was, in terms of the issues of Gregor Mendel, also it's noteworthy. Darwin doesn't seem to have drawn on Mendel's work to develop his own ideas about what is the genetic, getting at what we now know as genetics. What is the operative process behind the inherited traits? So we can start to understand that. Well, okay, Darwin really wasn't looking into. He wasn't really talking with specialists so much and getting to a literacy in the metaphysics and about the religious issues that had concerned him. He was comfortable even though he was and so that, I guess that refers to Emma, his wife, right? Darwin married Emma, who was very much involved in religious issues, very concerned about religious issues in Christianity. And so that is another angle on epistemology, which in education is used in terms of individuals and how individuals think, which I see more in terms of Piaget, if you know what that's all about, which gets us into additional issues. Piaget uses more of a terminology, has his own terminology about how individuals think, people's schemas, for example, that I tend to use, and I tend to see that term as more applicable than actually epistemology. But there it is. People use them in those terms and in those ways. So that already gives us an introduction to then some of the diversity of things that we'll come to more later. Gandhi then was a lawyer, right, talking about epistemology. So he was a secular Indian guy, not a practicing Hindu, just a secular guy, a bit with some distaste for the Christianity that he had seen, who, while he was studying law in London then, was a vegetarian. He carried over an interest in vegetarianism that brought him into contact with interfaith theosophists. And so with the theosophists, he gained some orientation, or an important orientation towards interfaith study and research. All right, turn off here.